Go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate Fraying Fabric, how trade policy and industrial decline transformed America. My name is Heather, and I'm the Senior Publicity Manager at the University of Illinois Press. And I'm just going to go over some brief logistical information and introduce our guests before we get started. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Benton and Dr. Parmet for being here today. They're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for a 15-minute Q&A at the end. You can enter questions throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use promo code HOLIDAY22 to get a 50% discount on Fraying Fabric on the University of Illinois Press website during our holiday sale. I'll put the promo code and a link to the book in the chat box. We will also be recording this event and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. You'll receive an email from Zoom after the event that will have both the discount code and a link to our YouTube channel as well. And now I'll just briefly introduce our guests. James C. Benton is director of the Race and Economic Empowerment Project at the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and Working Poor at Georgetown University. He connects the initiative with grassroots organizations working for economic justice in Washington, D.C. Fraying Fabric is his first book. It is drawn from a dissertation of the same name that won the Herbert Gutman Prize in 2017. These works arose from his curiosity around the decline of the textile industry in his home community. Before entering academia, he spent more than a decade in journalism in North Carolina, Ohio, and Washington, covering all levels of government from township halls to Capitol Hill. He also worked for 5 years in the nonprofit sector, conducting research on money in politics and congressional ethics, and lobbying for the 2006 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. Robert Parmet is professor of history at the York College of the City University of New York and author of The Master of Seventh Avenue, David Dubinsky in the American Labor Movement, Labor and Immigration in Industrial America, Town and Gown, The Fight for Social Justice, Urban Rebirth and Higher Education, and co-author of American Nativism, 1830 to 1860. He has also written numerous articles and book reviews. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists. Thanks again to everyone for being here today.
And once again, I fall into the trap of not unmuting soon enough. Thank you, Heather, and thanks everyone for joining today. And I'm glad to be here and glad to take part in the discussion. Look forward to a good hour of talk about my work, and also answering whatever questions you may have.
Good afternoon, and I thank you, Heather, and I also thank you, James, for affording me the opportunity to discuss your book with you. And I must say that it is a magnificent work. It really is something that needed to be written, was written, and really has changed me. Okay, very much so. And let me say here, I guess, for starters, basically, to get things going, that I had grown up through all sorts of school levels, believing in the so-called new international order of following the Second World War. It meant internationalism in politics, in trade, in everything, a free flow of ideas, information, and goods. And this book really has set me a thinking about all of this, and really compelled me to re-examine attitudes, in particular with regard to tariffs, restrictions, and things that I had pretty much taken for granted, and things that seem to be relative to perhaps even 19th century debates, high tariff, low tariff, strictly political, not terribly important, but good as political devices. Now I see things in a different light. I see tariffs as affected by domestic politics, international politics, and a whole slew of things. You've opened my eyes. And in so doing, I'd like to ask about some of the topics that you touch upon. Most of the time these days, we seem to think of the 70s and 80s as marking the beginning of deindustrialization, globalization, and decline, general industrial decline in the United States. What this book does, what your book does, is push us back. It takes us back to the early 20th century. It takes us back to a hero to many of us, Franklin Roosevelt, and makes us re-examine his policies, which don't come across as positive as many of us had thought. How do you feel about that?
Well, I have to say that the book, let me preface my answer by saying that the book is somewhat a reflection of an autobiographical experience. And what I mean by that is I grew up in a textile community in Western North Carolina, and left town just before NAFTA came through, a few years before NAFTA, and then the landscape changed. Plants began closing. Plants that had workers on short time had fewer workers, and then they closed too. So there was a lot of anger directed at the Clinton administration because they were the ones who implemented NAFTA. It was negotiated by George H.W. Bush, but Clinton was the president who, through Congress, got the agreement put into place. And I knew that was part of the answer, but I didn't think it was the whole answer. And so I went back and looked at, after my career in journalism and finally making it into academia as a grad student, I started looking, and the more I looked, the more I realized that you couldn't stop at NAFTA. You couldn't stop at 1991 or 92. You had to go back further. And so I chose the starting point of 1934, because that was where the trade regime changed from the Smoot-Hawley tariff law of 1930, and essentially with corrections in the 1960s and 1974 is largely the system we have today. If I were a broader, if I had a broader historical view, I would argue you could go back further. You could go back to the beginnings of tariff law in the United States as a young nation. But since I'm 20th century historian, I started focusing on FDR. Now, what I found there was that I set up this argument that the New Deal was intended to accomplish several things. And one was this program of reform and renewal to bring the country, the United States, and hopefully by extent the world, out of the Great Depression in the early 30s, early to mid 30s. Another intersecting piece of the New Deal was the worker protections that were added, such as Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act, and then later, when that was struck down by the Supreme Court, its replacement, which we now know as the Wagner Act of 1935, which establishes workers' right to collectively to form unions and collectively bargain. But the argument that I developed as in the course of the dissertation was in the book was that this intersection between trade promotion and worker protection never really materialized. There was more of a focus on promoting trade for various political reasons, as opposed to any effort to really strengthen worker rights, give workers a voice on the job, to protect the right to unionize. In fact, it takes steps back with Taft-Hartley, and then from the 1950s on, as labor density declines, there's really nothing to fill that vacuum that is left by the weaker voice of labor. So my thinking is that FDR, did accomplish several things, but this has to be seen as one of those areas where the reforms that he put forth may not have been as far-reaching, but they get obscured because of so many other things that the Roosevelt administration did, and also because of the war effort that followed in the 1940s. So it does make us rethink FDR and his role and this idea of, and by extension, Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State, because the State Department then assumes control of trade negotiations, which before 1934 had been in the purview of Congress, which negotiated agreements and passed them. What we wind up having there is, instead of a process called log rolling, where lobbyists would shape what tariff levels and what products were to be taxed on import and export, suddenly it becomes more the purview of the executive branch. And you, over the course of the book, you see these congressional prerogatives being replaced by executive branch prerogatives. So I'll stop there for now.
Well, looking at the situation, I think if we're going to assign culpability for the lack of worker protection, can't we do as you do in your book, cast a harsh light on the American South and how the South, with its attitudes, one, weakened the New Deal, very much affected the worker legislation of the New Deal, and also, of course, weakened the unions. Are we talking about failures of organization attempts in the New Deal, even before the 20s, and then certainly going to the post-war era, Operation Dixie. And you might even extend that to this very day. The South and politics relative to the South and the ability or inability to pass legislation had to have an impact on this, had to weaken labor's hand, FDR's hand, JFK's hand, LBJ's hand, everybody's hand.
Right. And mainly because the difficulty that workers had in forming unions. You talk about before the New Deal. I look at 4 unions in the book: the United Textile Workers, the Textile Workers Union, which formed after the CIO, during the CIO drives of the 1930s, the ILGWU, and then the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. The United Textile Workers did make efforts to organize in the South in the 1900s and were soundly defeated just about everywhere they tried. And then during the New Deal, you had workers, again, mostly represented by United Textile Workers in New England, but some sympathizers in the South and some a spare local here and there. They have this massive strike. 400,000 people nationwide walk up the job in September 1934. And there were no protections against those workers who struck, or protections for those workers. And as a result, they began to get disillusioned. So when Operation Dixie arises 10 or 12 years later after the war, these people want no part of it. Politically speaking, the South figures prominently, not just in the New Deal, but also in the presidential politics of the 1960s and 1970s. What I mean by that is the way in which the South influences the New Deal. One of the examples I looked at was, of course, the one we know around Social Security, where domestic workers and agricultural workers are left out of protections when Social Security is created in the 1930s. But this anti-union atmosphere that you see in the South does cause harm as time moves forward, because the unions, instead of being able to have some kind of organization nationwide, there's this large gap in the South. And that comes into play because as imports begin to increase in textiles and apparel, especially after World War II, those unions they have power and they have influence, but they don't have the numerical strength of their counterparts like the UAW or the United Steelworkers. And therefore, they have a hard time really convincing these political leaders of the importance of imports. They get their ear. They get a couple of a couple of bones thrown their way, but they never really have the type of influence that these other unions and other industries do. And so it does become an issue. And then I'll go back to the political implications. When John Kennedy was running for president in 1960, one of the key blocks that he used to win enough support to win the election was Southern textile executives, organized basically on his behalf by Fritz Hollings, then the governor of South Carolina, later a longtime U.S. senator from South Carolina. And then they began to press, and they get improvements through a 1961 program that Kennedy puts into place to help revitalize the textile industry. But however, that alliance becomes undone by the late 1960s. They don't have the same amount of influence with LBJ as they had with Kennedy. And so it falls to another South Carolinian, this time Strom Thurmond, who had by this time left the Democrats and become a Republican in the mid-60s, to corral the Southern textile executives in 1968 to support Richard Nixon. And so the South, going back to your original question, does figure prominently in some of the changes and some of the trends that we see in terms of trade policy, but also in terms of labor's effectiveness or ineffectiveness in fighting against imports, because they're spending so much time trying to organize the region that they don't have the opportunity to really mount a effective fight against imports. And so when those protests against import competition arrive in the mid to late 1960s, it's largely populated by union members from the Northeast, from the Mid-Atlantic states, from the Midwest, from the West Coast. And what's missing? Largely, there were Southern workers who did protest imports, but the South is largely missing from this picture entirely.
Well, let me ask you about these unions. Mm-hmm. And we talk about the Southern influence, but isn't it also true that, in a sense, workers' rights in this regard were sort of shoved aside because of, first, internal squabbling in the House of Labor, the split between AFL and CIO, the defensiveness of labor when attacked for racketeering, the Taft-Hartley Act. In other words, all of the things in addition to trade that preoccupied labor, that affected labor's survival. And we talk here too about the assault on labor once it reached its peak of appeal in the mid-1950s. There was clearly a concerted attack on organized labor, and precisely at the time that the trade problem really became most extreme. Yes. And finally, by 1970, as you point out in your book, it was there. It was noticeable. So we talk about let's say 1955 to 1970. The assault on labor, racketeering, everything that went with that. And here, workers find themselves without jobs.
Yeah. When I look back and I think about the research that I did around that particular period, labor is involved. Let's make that clear. But their involvement is always drawn to other issues. It's drawn to, there is a concern about domestic recovery, especially in the early 60s from the recessions of the late 1950s. But as far as imports, it was always in the background. It was never front and center with all of the 4 unions that I cover in this book. They were concerned about organizing again in the South. And then there were battles within unions like the Textile Workers Union between high-ranking individuals over the direction of organizing. And then there were these large campaigns to organize huge Southern textile manufacturers. So the trade issue at that time, there were these one-off types of agreements in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, not to impose import quotas, which would have gotten the United States into hot water with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and other countries, not to mention it would make people in other industries, domestic industries that were susceptible to import competition, eager to impose quotas of their own. It made the United States, through the State Department, was implementing these carefully negotiated, off the table, behind the scenes agreements with Taiwan. They were trying to do one with Hong Kong. It didn't work. So they were trying to influence these countries to ship more of their goods elsewhere. And that, by the 1960s, that completely breaks down. Their efforts to limit or govern the international trade in textiles in the early 1960s. And it seems like wherever, it's almost like you're trying to put out a leak in one place and it springs up elsewhere. You try to limit imports from one country, suddenly the industry moves to another country that doesn't have these restrictions, and then they send their goods in. So, but during this time, labor as a whole, not just the textile and apparel unions, labor as a whole still held on to this ideal, this Cold War ideal, that we needed trade in order to combat the Soviet bloc from expanding, to have access to the newly forming European Economic Union community, now the EU. And the argument was that if we don't trade with Western Europe, then the Soviets are going to, and they're going to have influence, which is an echo of what you heard in 2000 over permanent normalized trading relations with China. If we don't trade with China, the rest of the world will, and we'll be left out in the cold. So labor is concerned about trade, but it's in the sense of Cold War politics. It's not in the sense of preserving domestic jobs or industries or helping them to compete more effectively against import competition. And because it is in the background of all these other issues related to corruption or organizing or unionizing the South, and then later in the 1960s, Vietnam takes center stage. It's not until 1969 that the AFL-CIO as a federation, which today marks the anniversary of the 1955 merger between both AFL and CIO, they don't get into talking about trade as a legitimate concern for domestic economic affairs, and finally start taking action around it in 1969. And by 1974, they finally oppose a trade bill, the Trade Act of 1974, but they don't have the strength to outflank the multinational corporations or politicians who favor the principle of lowering international barriers to trade to increase trade. And so that really sets the stage for what we observed in the 1990s with NAFTA. And it's this whole picture that this book helps uncover, that really what happened in the 1990s and beyond with NAFTA and China is a direct result of all this lead up to from the 1950s to the 1970s, and also from the 1930s up to the present day.
In your book, you attribute the success of Donald Trump in 2016, in good part, to the disaffected white workers.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't you go back even to George Wallace and then draw a line right there?
I don't know that George Wallace himself would be a benefactor of this type of politics, but there was the politics of resentment over riots in America's cities in the late 1960s, and this feeling that law and order had lost hold and needed to reassert control. But in those years, there were protests against import competition, some of which featured very ugly racial and ethnic stereotypes against Asian nations, Asian producers. Some of the imagery didn't make the book, but some of those images included people dressed up in hastily made outfits, claiming that they were made in Hong Kong as a criticism of the quality of their clothing. But other protest signs would be written in fake Chinese characters, English characters stylized to look like Chinese language. Protesters, now this did get into the book, protesters did speak of import competition in terms of an invasion. Some use the analogy of Pearl Harbor as an example. So, I think George Wallace might not have talked about those economic issues as directly as Trump did in 2015 and 2016, but he certainly would have benefited, and I'm talking about Wallace here, he certainly would have benefited from the environment that was created. And I think that, the economic, what was the term that was roundly denounced after 2016? It was economic anxiety. And I think people believe that this had been disproven, that people weren't just upset about the economy. It had to have been the economy in concert with something else. And what I found was that I think there were enough people who were concerned or angry about the loss of jobs, the loss of stability, the loss of status, and they were able to consciously or unconsciously find common cause with people who favored a candidate like Trump because of the idea of lower taxes. And together they formed this bit of a coalition that resulted in an electoral win, although the popular vote fell short. Now, there's something within that picture that I tried to suss out, and I think deserves a little bit more scrutiny as time goes on, because we have more data now. And that is the distinction between how the white working class voter, how the white working class vote broke down along Democratic and Republican lines, how there was more of a plurality of white working class voters who favored Trump, but then a vast majority of African-American working class voters favored Clinton, and a plurality of Latino working class voters favored Clinton as well. So there's a key question in here about what does this mean? Because we're moving toward a point where, about a decade or so, 2032 is the estimate, the last estimate I saw, workers of color are going to comprise the majority of the working class in the United States. And so if the voting patterns are this disparate, what does that mean for working class politics in the United States? What does that mean for the labor movement as a whole? Have they begun to recognize this, and have they begun to find ways to say, look, we need to get on the same page to create an economy that works for all people, regardless of race, class, socioeconomic status, what have you? But yeah, I do think, to go to your original question, I do think Wallace would have capitalized on this if those economic concerns about imports had been raised as loudly, or about trade policy had been raised as loudly in 1968 as they certainly were, or resounding in people's minds in 2015 and 2016.
I think there was a problem not only with the low level of concern, but also the inconsistency or perhaps insincerity of our leaders. And here, and I hate to say it, there are people I had supported. I'm thinking of John Kennedy,
Right.
Lyndon Johnson, and of course, if we talk about politicians as presidents, Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
There's no line here of concern, not at all. And of course, Vietnam coming right in the middle of it, the civil rights the revolution also in the middle of it. This is something that could be sloughed off, pushed aside, and it was. And then, of course, exploited handsomely by conservative Republicans after Nixon. How do you feel about that?
Well, I tried not to find. Well, let me go back. When I started the research, I thought there would be some kind of smoking gun, so to speak, where I would say some kind of document, some kind of communication where I could point to and say, aha, this is where it all began. And what I found was there were no simple answers, no cut and dry, black and white answers. And I gotta think that throughout the book itself, all the people we look at as heroes or villains in the way we think about trade now, really, you cannot use that type of approach. You cannot use that type of lens. People who you look at as heroes have flaws. People you look at as villains have some virtues. And I say this across the board. No president is, I don't think any president that I look at in this book emerges as a hero or as a villain. I don't think any labor leader or labor union emerges as a hero or as a villain. I don't think any corporation in the textile and apparel industry emerges as a hero or a villain. They all made some really egregious mistakes. And one of them, I think, is the idea that American economic dominance would continue unabated in the decades following World War II. Now, Nixon by 1970 starts to recognize that this is not the case and does make some efforts to change it, but it's also within the context of presidential politics. He wants to build a stronger economy because he wants to make sure that he holds on to the presidency in 1972. He wants to combat inflation, and he wants to bring trade into greater balance because by 1971, the balance of trade had fallen into deficit for the first time in nearly a century. And so he wanted to bring that back onto the surplus side, but that was in the context of winning in 1972. So, you know, all the heroes you look at, FDR, JFK, Nixon, you know, on and on, they don't, there is no particular hero or particular villain. What I say, and I'm repeating myself a little here, but what I'm saying is that political leaders made mistakes because, again, their prerogatives for trade never seem to include helping or securing workers whose jobs were at risk or helping communities. There are proposals, there are laws, there are programs, but the effort to aid workers and communities always seems to be an afterthought, whether it's the Area Redevelopment Act of 1961, whether it's trade adjustment assistance, which comes in 1962, and finally gets used by 1969 because the criteria for it were so stringent that nobody qualified for it for the first 7 years of its existence. Labor leaders come in for scrutiny because of their embrace of Cold War politics, and then coming late to the game as a federation in recognizing the issues and difficulties caused by trade on workers and communities, and then workers themselves, because they recognized early on, especially in the 1930s, when trade deals were being negotiated under Cordell Hull in the State Department, they realized the dangers of lowering barriers to trade and import competition, but they couldn't get the leaders of especially the CIO unions and leaders of the AFL. They couldn't get those leaders to recognize the challenge that workers immediately recognized. They knew that lowering barriers was going to bring more goods in, and especially in the boot, shoe, and textile industries in New England, that was going to mean the possibility of losing their jobs. And so, you know, all the ideas of heroes and villains, you know, this political party, that political party, free trade, you know, protectionism versus free trade, all that. When you read this book, you have to throw that out the window, because nobody's a saint. Nobody's a saint. Everybody's a sinner, is what I'm trying to say. and you know, every hero has some vices, and every villain has some virtues, no matter how you slice it.
In that regard, let me introduce another element: the multinationals.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's just colossal conflict of interest here.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about it?
How so? How so?
Well, they're playing both sides. Okay. Quite clearly. All right. And how could they worry about American workers?
Right.
That's the truth.
I mean, they advanced an idea that a lot of us have taken for granted, because that's how we've seen it in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. This idea of a corporation that is beholden to no particular government, that operates without borders, that moves from place to place, that shifts capital, resources, and you know, production from place to place, wherever it may benefit them. And you know, the conglomerate is nothing new, but this idea of a business entity that moves so freely across borders to take advantage of whatever laws exist, that does throw a wrench into the works. And labor did recognize this. They put together pamphlets documenting the power of multinationals and the problem that it caused, because now, instead of a product being manufactured in the United States by an American worker, it's being manufactured someplace else where wages are lower, where protections are fewer, where the profit margin is greater, and then it's shipped back to the United States and sold to the consumer, probably for the same price that it was sold when it was manufactured in the United States by an American worker. So therefore, that company makes a larger profit, and the worker who doesn't have the means, because they don't have the job now, is spending money for a good money that they don't have for a good. Now, in the case of textiles and apparel, you see that shifted onto lower wage nations, and those imports are lower cost, and that sets up this interesting dilemma. In the book, I write about a woman named Anne Fleming from upstate New York, who writes a letter to George Meany asking him to get together with Richard Nixon and fight imports. And she's saying, "You're a very powerful man, Mr. Meany. Can't you and Mr. Nixon talk about imports? Can't you do something about this?" And she goes on, and at the end of the letter, and I still remember being in the archive, opening the letter, and this thing falls out, and I look at it, and it's a price tag. And she mentions the price tag. She said, "You know, this is the problem that we are facing in this country. The other day, I bought 4 blouses. They cost $1 a piece. And I'm putting this tag in to remind you that this is the problem that we're facing, and this should be stopped." So you have this dilemma where multinationals in some way are driving this situation by which jobs are fleeing the country. And in some cases, they're creating these situations where, as consumers, people are taking advantage of the lower cost goods that are made possible by that same process. And you know, it was just a perfect encapsulation of the problem and the I don't want to say opportunity because it seems like an inappropriate word, but that shows two of the sides of the trade issue. You know, the possibility of losing a job that you need to manufacture stuff, but also as a consumer, the opportunity to have access to goods that cost less than you would have paid if they were made here. And that opens up a big question about, you know, how do you strike a balance between that? Is it possible to find a balance? And is there a way to combat the activities of multinationals to bring about this system of capital flight and the system by which they essentially play countries, member states against each other while recognizing little to no state boundaries in terms of their own existence?
Well, let me just touch upon in the remaining time, I guess, that we have, the word consumer. Has there been any kind of significant consumer pressure to forsake low prices for worker protection?
In the book, I did find some, as I was researching, I did find some examples here and there, but not necessarily a sustained example. You know, there's this idea, the amalgamated clothing workers, they would do before they took to the streets in 1970. For years, they would do these informational pickets outside of stores that sold imported clothing. And they would hand out these notices to consumers going into the stores saying, hey, this shop sells imported goods. We want you to think about that as you make your decision as a consumer, as you decide with your dollars what to buy. Just remember that if you're buying an imported good because it's cheaper, you run the risk of putting us out of work. And there were, you know, they tried this in Chicago, and Marshall Fields lost their mind because they were saying, you know, we're trying to get the consumer what they want, but the amalgamated was saying, look, we fought the sweatshop here, we're going to fight the sweatshop over there, whether it comes from Asia, whether it comes from the maquiladoras in northern Mexico. We're going to fight it because that was a threat to our livelihood then. It is a threat to our livelihood now. But there never seemed to be a sustained, comprehensive campaign. It shows up in various places, like in front of these department stores. It shows up in congressional testimony. It shows up in general discussion of trade issues and its impact on people. But there's never really, as far as I could find, a sustained effort to say, hey, consumers, think about what you're doing, think about how you spend your money, and think about its impact. And I think today in some quarters, you do have people who have an awareness of that. But again, as far as a sustained broader type of offensive to tell people, you know, think about what you're doing and think about the consequences of your actions as consumers. We're more likely now to hear about lower costs as a benefit. You know, the Walmarts of the world, the people who have slashed prices on goods so that you can run a Walmart or Target or whatever off discount store exists and get something for really cheap. You know, they think about the convenience and the low price, but they don't really tell you about the other side of it, which is that maybe this good was being made in the United States 10, 15 years ago, and now it's being made in China or Bangladesh or Vietnam or some other country like that. There's an awareness, but there's no real, I don't think there's any real effort to drive that point home to millions of consumers and to remind them of how their votes as consumers have an effect on this whole issue of trade and commerce.
Would a greater number of union members, a greater percentage of workers as union members, make a difference there?
I'd like to say yes, it would. And I think if you had a larger number of labor members, if say the textile and apparel unions had success in organizing the South, you could have had a broad-based national labor organization, truly national, with representation in the place where that industry was at its strongest in the early 20th century, early to mid 20th century, building alliances with local politicians and members of Congress, building alliances with business, even though they might have been very adversarial. I think it could have made a difference. Would it have been enough to stop the industrialization? I don't think so. But I think it would have been enough to really make people think about how this fabric that I talk about as part of the title of the book, between worker protections and trade policy as a recovery device, it might have made people think about that more clearly and in more stark terms, and it could have inspired a different outcome. I don't know if it would have stopped deindustrialization, because the rest of the world was going to rebuild from World War II and was going to challenge the United States economic dominance anyway. But if we had had more union members, there might have been an opportunity for some kind of alliance between labor and capital and the state to really tackle this issue. It might have been a little closer to the front of people's minds, as opposed to being supplanted by issues like Vietnam, or being supplanted by the civil rights movement, or being supplanted by the need to fight corruption, or whatever internecine struggles were taking place within the labor movement itself. So I got to think that, I won't say it would have made a difference, but I think it could have altered the course that unfolded. And maybe perhaps in that altered trajectory, there could have been some different, very different outcomes.
You have any forecast for the future? You think things will get better?
I got to think, look, we're still in the midst of a pandemic, and although things are opening up more, one thing that I feel is different is that people as workers, are starting to realize more clearly that they have to speak out in favor of improving their condition. Even though the laws, as we see with the Starbucks workers, as we see with Amazon, as we see with other unionization efforts in the past years, the laws are not strong enough to really give any significant protection to workers. But I think, will it be different? I think so, as long as we have workers in this country who really aren't willing to accept the status quo, and who are willing to speak out, and who are willing to find ways to strengthen and improve their workplaces, to strengthen and improve their establishments, to strengthen and improve their communities. It would be helpful if the laws caught up with modern reality, But I think as long as we have workers here who are advocating for better things, that there is always that possibility of improvement. Now, on the political scene, that's going to take a lot of work. because we've reached a very ugly point in American politics from 2016 forward, and it's going to take a battle to get to something resembling a sense of normalcy. But I think that there too, greater involvement is the only way to wrest power in a direction that is more beneficial to a greater number of people than what we have at the current moment. So I'm optimistic, but the odds are, the odds are steep and the stakes are really high right now. So we need, we need all the help we can get.
I think the key word there is involvement.
Yes.
And awareness.
Yes.
I thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for this opportunity. And before we go to the Q&A, I did want to say one thing. There was a person that I left out of the acknowledgments that I meant to include, and that is my sister Sandra, who is out in California. She, like the rest of my family, put up with me for the better part of 15 years while I was working on this book. And when I wrote the acknowledgments, I accidentally omitted her. So I just wanted to put that back in there so she knows that she's appreciated. So thank you. And thanks to the audience for listening to our discussion. And I look forward to whatever questions we have here.
Yeah, it looks like we've got a couple of that have come in. So our first question is from Gregory, and they ask, how much does declining cost of transporting goods enable greater international trade from about 1945 to the 1970s?
Declining costs of transportation?
Yeah, of transporting goods.
Transporting goods. I don't know that I really looked that closely at that factor, because what I tended to look at was the inputs of labor and specifically raw goods like raw cotton. The transportation costs I did not factor in, so I'm afraid I can't be of better help in answering that question. But what I will say is the things that I did study, especially in the first decade, the 15 years after World War II, was that this was a very significant challenge. And the example that I'm thinking about is Japan in the mid-1950s, because they were buying domestic cotton grown in the United States at a price that was lower than domestic textile producers were paying by 8 cents per pound. And it's part of a bill that was designed to increase exports of cotton from the United States. But the Japanese workers in those mills were working with modernized equipment, in many cases much newer than their American counterparts, and the workers were paid about 1/10 of the wage of their American counterparts. So you've got American grown cotton being spun on producing textiles on newer machines by workers making 1/10 of the wage of their American counterparts. That is a disaster for undermining any industry, even before you start to factor in declining costs of transport. So so this is the type of problem that we were facing as a country in the 1950s, and part of the problem that we're facing now. And I think the inverse is going to show up too, because now with the cost of fossil fuels rising and the push to get into to move away from fossil fuels and a carbon-free, renewable energy and that sort of thing, now the cost of transporting those goods is going to start increasing, and I think that's going to pose an opportunity for domestic producers to really look at reshoring in a greater sense. So sorry I couldn't address that question directly, but I think it is a factor in where things were then, and I think it is going to be a factor now and into the future.
Okay, so our next question comes from Lou Martin, and they say, I can't wait to read your book, Dr. Benton. My question is, when did workers on the ground in North Carolina mill towns start expressing concerns about trade imports? And did non-union workers find a way to make their voices heard about trade policies?
Mhm. Coming from that state, I think we see workers begin to make more of a concerted effort on trade competition in the 1970s or so. Not it doesn't seem like it follows the textile counterparts in, say, Massachusetts and New England, who in the 1930s were keenly aware of the effort of of the impact of import competition. As to whether non-union workers were involved, I gotta say, I can't answer that with any certainty, because much of the research that I did focused on the records of labor unions. And so they would be talking about their members, and much of the South was absent from those records. So absent me going back to other archives and looking at sources that were not generated by labor unions, it will be really hard to determine the percentage of non-union workers who did take part in trade protests or who were aware of foreign competition and spoke out. So, so this is one of those areas where it's really a work in progress, unfortunately. But I got to think that you find, if I find the right resource and the right archival collection, that you would probably find non-union workers who were definitely concerned about competition. But because where I started was with the labor unions themselves and their records, I faced a couple of blind spots, one which was the lack of workers in the South, and then the lack of coverage of workers who weren't in unions as a whole.
All right, so our next question is from James Bearden, and they ask, do you think textile jobs will return to North Carolina?
I think they did start to return in the last decade or so, but that was mainly because of direct foreign investment from China. You have Chinese Chinese companies coming into the Carolinas and opening mills, and that's a real mixed bag, because you've got the direct foreign investment, but you've also got this weird dynamic with workers who are now being prodded by Chinese management, and that doesn't necessarily go over very well in some cases. You know, it's not well, there's a job, you should be glad to have a job. It's now a tension that, hey, here's a country that might have been directly implicated in cutting our jobs, and now they're back and telling us what to do. Now, I took a trip to Italy a couple months ago, and over there in Italy, there's a textile center, Prato, which is right outside Florence, and they had a similar issue in the aughts, around 2007. A lot of direct foreign investment from the Chinese. They bought out a lot of the mills that had been there. Prato has been producing textiles, woolen textiles, for more than a millennium. And Prato has now, as a result of this direct foreign investment and the animosity that it generated, is now one of the centers of right-wing political activism in the whole country. So there's a bit of tension there. Let me go back to your original question, though. I think that even with these political considerations, there are efforts in the Carolinas to bring back jobs, to produce textiles in new ways. I toured a plant in Western North Carolina back in August in the city of Morganton. It's a cooperative called Opportunity Commons, and they have a textile production facility where they take waste from products, chop it up, reform new filaments, and then make hats and socks and other products out of it. And then during that tour, we also visited a t-shirt manufacturer in Burlington, a couple hours to the east, that is also interested in producing t-shirts and other textiles. So I think there are efforts to recreate the industry and to bring back the jobs. The difference is that these industries are going to be smaller. They're going to be targeted at specific products. They're not going to be the huge mills that have 2 and 3 shifts operating around the clock. It's going to be these smaller entities that put together specialized goods. And I think that's crucial, because if we're trying to be competitive, we can no longer compete on mass production of goods. We have to be able to add value to goods in a way that our competitors abroad cannot. And we have to be able to shift and change in order to stay ahead, that when a foreign competitor develops the same product, that we have had enough research in the book to take the product that we have and take it a step or 2 further to stay ahead of that competitor. Because if it's making the same thing, the rest of the world will catch up to us. If it's a new product that takes advantage of our ability to add value to things, and we continue to research and develop it, then we continue to stay ahead of that. So I think there's an opportunity for jobs to come back, but it's going to be, it's not going to look the same, and the outcome's not going to be different. I mean, not going to be the same. And because of the option of direct foreign investment, you also have the potential for some really ugly things to happen, as given in the example I cited in Italy, in South Carolina.
All right, we have time for just one more question. This comes from Dan, and Dan has some other questions that I'll send to you after this, but this is a good one for us to close out with. And he asks, where do you see your research headed next?
Oh boy. I've given this some thought, and it could go in one of several directions. I talked about the lack of our laws to catch up with our labor situation, and I'm really interested in looking at the Darlington case again. And what that means in shorthand is a mill in Darlington, South Carolina, voted to unionize. Its operators closed it, and after a legal battle, the workers got repaid for the plant being shut down. There's just one wrinkle. The company delayed the process so long that it took 25 years. The unionization vote took place in 1956. The payout happened as part of a settlement in 1981, because the laws allowed a company to delay and send the case to court and appeal and appeal and appeal and appeal. And so by the time the payments were made, about a third of those went to heirs as opposed to the original workers. So that's one area. I'm curious about how this trade policy that I write about in Fraying Fabric played out in different industries. And I'm thinking about the auto industry, I'm thinking about the steel industry, to see how there are similarities and differences that could be compared, and how those industries' outcomes played a role in political, in presidential politics and in the overall trajectory of the United States. And a third area would be seizing on that breakdown between white, Black, Latino, working class votes, and to see what is labor doing to address this issue? What are other entities doing to address this issue? And is there a way to get people on the same page uh, not so much politically in terms of voting for a particular candidate as much as it is understanding that their destinies are bound together and that they need to figure out what the step is together as workers, as opposed to identifying with some kind of identity politics, whether it be white working class voters or African American or Latino voters. What do workers think about what is best for their cause as workers in this economy, in this country? So those are some ideas that I've been tossing around, and I like all of them, but I got to pick one really soon. So so stay tuned.
Well, we look forward to seeing what you have coming next. Thank you all so much for this event today. Do you have any final thoughts for us before we go?
I would like to repeat my feeling here that this book is spectacular. It is well written, well researched. It causes us to think and should be read by everyone. It's an amazing, really, work.
All I have to say is thank you again for taking an hour of your time today to hear us discuss this, and I really appreciate it. As far as Robert's comments, I'm very tickled. This took a lot of. This was a 15-year work, and I put a lot into it, and I hope that as you read that, whether you agree or disagree, whether you like or dislike, just realize that it was a hard-won battle every step of the way. And I look forward to talking with you all in the future as to what your thoughts are about it. And with that, I would just say, get your hands on a copy as soon as you can and devour it and let me know what you think.
And if you'd like to get a copy, just remember that we are having a holiday sale. You can use code HOLIDAY22 to get 50% off until December 31st. So make sure to take advantage of that. And with that, thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.